Hello, everyone. Hello. It's lovely to be here. Before I start, I just wanted to say that Sweden is the one country that gives my books the best covers. So I feel very fondly about Sweden. It's lovely to be here. So what if I told each of you to tell me the first thing that comes to mind when I say the word Africa? Now, so for some of you, it might be wildlife or safari or beautiful landscapes. And for some of you, it might also be images associated with corruption, AIDS, poverty, hunger. And why is this? Because in the popular imagination and in mass media, we are constantly shown images of Africa as a place of just catastrophe. So we see how Africa is dying, and we don't see how Africa lives. We see what Africans cannot do, and we don't see what Africans can do. And most of all, we see what we can do for Africa. So Africa becomes a place where you can go and build its wells and feed its children, a place where you can go do your charity. I have a Norwegian friend who was recently telling me that his 4-year-old daughter started to collect all the loose change in their home. And when he asked her why, she said she wanted to give the money to Africans, which I thought was very sweet. But also it struck me that at so young an age, the only conception she had of Africa was of a place that needed her charity. I was born and raised in Nigeria, and I've noticed that among my fellow Nigerians, complaining about our problems is an art form. So a conversation with friends or taxi drivers or hair braiders very quickly become impassioned rants about our country's problems, about our terrible government officials, about the roads and the schools and the electricity supply and that sort of thing. But when a foreigner, particularly a non-African foreigner, says the exact same things, Nigerians become furious. Now, I've always been curious about this particular brand of Nigerian defensiveness, which I happen to have in sizable amounts, by the way. And so I've often wondered why we have this defensiveness. After all, what the foreigners say about us is true. And it seems to me that we are defensive because we know that the Nigerians who complain about our problems know the other stories of Nigeria from lived experience, know that Nigerians have a lot of resourcefulness, ingenuity, know about what Nigerians dream about, what they aspire to, what motivates them, what they value. And we sense that the foreigners don't know these other stories, and so that they're more likely to see us only as about our problems, only as a charity case. And so our defensiveness emerges. We are defensive because we are eager to preserve that most elusive and most important of human qualities, dignity. We are defensive because we don't want to be reduced to a charity case alone. Some years ago, I was having a conversation with a friend who told me that I was one of those privileged Africans because of what she called my privileged upbringing and my privileged background. Now, I was taken aback. I had never been called privileged in my life. I had never thought of myself as privileged. I had grown up being very aware of privilege, and to me, privilege meant those Nigerian children who went abroad every summer and who had a driver designated the children's driver. And so after this acquaintance friend sort of told me that I was privileged, my first reaction was to push back the label, to reject it, to say that of course I wasn't privileged. I thought to myself, how can I possibly be privileged After all, we didn't have a children's driver. And of course, this, the children's driver, was a symbol of both affluence and indulgence, a symbol of a small class of people who could take for granted things that I could not even conceive of. I did not have the things they had. I did not live the lives they led. And so in my mind, I was not privileged. I grew up in Nsukka, which is a small university town in eastern Nigeria, and my parents worked at the university, my father as a professor, my mother as an administrator. And so my entire life, until I became an adult, was spent on the campus of the University of Nigeria at Nsukka. Nsukka was a sleepy town of rolling hills and dust, and the houses sat side by side, and they were separated by carefully trimmed hedges. I went to the university primary school and the university secondary school, and it was a very safe and happy childhood. And now, looking back as an adult, it seems to me perilously close to idyllic. But in my mind, it was not at all privileged. I told myself that it was not privileged because it was not wealthy. Yes, we lived in a 5-bedroom house, and we had a large yard where my brothers and I played soccer. And we had birthday presents and presents at Christmas. But there were also those long, sad months, especially during Nigeria's military governments of the 1980s and 1990s, when education was underfunded, and my parents were not paid their salaries regularly, and lecturers went on endless strikes, and we had boiled yam instead of toast for breakfast, and my mother began to ration out the milk, and our home wore a desolate air. And so, of course, I was not privileged. I told myself that I was not privileged because even though we did have drivers assigned to my father and my mother by the university, of course, we children did not dare order them around, as I was sure that those children who had a children's driver did. And then it struck me that part of being privileged is denying privilege. Of course I was privileged. It was easy, in comparing myself with people who had a children's driver, to conclude that I was not privileged. But what if I compared myself to people who not only lacked a children's driver, but also lacked all the many other things that I had? Why was denial my first reaction? Because of the immediate discomfort that the idea of being privileged brings. Because of the mix of guilt and defensiveness. Because of the realization that privilege brings with it a certain power. And it is a power we cannot necessarily do anything about. So I can't shrug off this power by denying my upbringing, for example. But it is important to me to be aware of it always and constantly aware of it. And most of all, it is important to me not to turn my privilege into a personal virtue, because it is not. I now call it acknowledging my privilege. To always be aware that I am privileged, and more importantly, to be aware that there are different layers and meanings of privilege. My family was far from wealthy, but we were the academic middle class. And so that meant that I had the good fortune of a good education, of being raised by parents who were themselves educated. And it meant that I was given the basic tools to navigate life in the modern world. Now, my cousins, on the other hand, were not given those tools. Their father, who is my father's brother, was not as academically gifted as my father, and so did not get the scholarships that my father got, did not get the education that my father got, and so his children did not have the privileges that my father's children had. My cousins lived in the village, and they did not go to the schools that I went to, not because they were not bright or willing, but because they were not given the opportunity. Like many African families, my family is extended. And the side of the family that has a bit more subsidizes the side of the family that has a bit less. And so while I was growing up, my parents supported my uncles and my aunts. And now I regularly send money to my uncles and my cousins and my aunts. I love my cousins very much. I'm very close to them. And yet, there was a part of me as I was growing up that felt That because my family was the family that constantly gave and not the family that received, that somehow we were better than my cousins. The wonderful South African writer Nadine Gordimer, who is white, writes about what she calls the great South African lie of white superiority. We whites, she writes, have the better part of everything, and it is difficult for us not to feel somewhere secretly that we are better. What Nadine Gordimer suggests is that white South Africans turned the privilege of their skin color into a virtue. It is very easy to become so entrenched in our privilege that we become blind to it. And not only do we become blind to it, we turn it into a virtue. Now, what acknowledging my privilege has done for me is that it has brought a certain humility to the way I look at the world and to the way I look at my place in the world. It enables me to say, yes, I work very hard, but also fate has indulged me. It enables me to see that I am able to do acts of kindness, not because I am somehow better than the people who receive these acts of kindness, but because I am privileged to be able to do these acts of kindness. Privilege and charity are very much connected. Privilege complicates charity. Acknowledging the ways in which we are privileged and the ways in which this privilege complicates our charity is, I think, very important. If I constantly give money to my cousins with no prospect of their ever earning the money themselves, I sometimes wonder whether at some point it becomes about my own goodness. And this makes me uncomfortable. Perhaps because my biggest dream is that we create a world in which there is no need for charity. My people, the Igbo of Eastern Nigeria, have a saying, "Akam ni nararira," which translates literally to, "all my fingers are not equal." But the degree of inequality between each of the fingers is quite small. And so I long for a world of much reduced inequality, a world in which the inequality is like the difference between my fingers. I long for a world in which there will be no need at all for charity. But until we get to that world, charity remains a necessity. Charity saves lives. Charity is saving lives right now in the Congo and Ethiopia, for example. But we must question the assumptions we bring to charity. For those of us who give charity, I think that there is often the risk of making one feel that one is better than those that one has helped. We are able to do charity not because we are better than poor people who cannot do the charity themselves, but because we are privileged. And in much the same way that I wonder about my relationship with my cousins and what my charity does to the way I see myself, I also sometimes wonder if there are people who need Africa to be poor. Not in an evil, plotting kind of way, but in a more subtle and metaphysical sense. Because only if Africa is poor do they have a chance to demonstrate their own goodness. A goodness that is often quite unreflective, that does not acknowledge its privileged place, and does not acknowledge that, but for accidents of history and birth, they themselves might have been in positions of receiving charity. Now, I am not suggesting at all that we all have equal abilities, because obviously we don't. Although it is true that for every person who has attained a position of privilege, there are two people who could have as well if they had been given the opportunity. My cousin, for example, whose name is Nneka, is very bright and would obviously have done as well as I did in school if she had been able to go to the same school that I went to. And so even though we didn't have a children's driver, I have learned to acknowledge the many ways in which I am privileged. There are people who are privileged in some areas and not in others, and people who, for example, didn't have a children's driver but had 3 warm meals on the table every day. A children's driver is my own symbol. For some other people, it might be, I'm not privileged because I don't have the big summer house, or I'm not privileged because I don't earn what my neighbor earns, or I'm not privileged because I don't have what my friend has. But we all are privileged in different ways, and it is important to keep that in mind, especially in doing acts of charity. And so in the end, for me, acknowledging my privilege is also a way to learn humility, but a practical kind of humility. The kind of humility that is free of hubris and free of false modesty. The kind of humility that acknowledges that we all are equally human, that we all are equally capable of being good people, of doing kind acts. The kind of humility that I think is the value that we will need when we finally create that wonderful world I dream about, that world in which there will be no need at all for charity. Thank you.